Hola y bienvenidos a este video donde vamos a hablar sobre la voz pasiva en español. Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to talk about the Spanish passive voice. Now the passive voice in English is when we use the verb to be with a past participle. For example, the book was written. That would be a passive statement. Now in Spanish, the passive isn't used quite as much as it is in English. I'm going to teach you 4 ways that you can translate the passive from English into Spanish that will make your Spanish sound a lot more natural and a lot more like a native speaker. Knowing these 4 ways will also help you to recognize these sorts of passive statements in Spanish and translate them back into English in a way that also sounds natural for an English speaker. Los retos de esta clase son entender la voz pasiva, qué es y cómo se usa, y practicar traducir la voz pasiva del inglés al español. The goals of this lesson are to understand the passive voice, what it is and how it's used, and to practice translating the passive voice from English into Spanish. Now actually in the first objective there, como se usa, that is actually an example of the passive voice. So in English we'd say how it is used, in the Spanish we'd say como se usa, which almost means how it uses itself. So we'll have a look at that as one of the 4 ways that we can translate it. So you'll learn how to do that by the end of this lesson. Now you've probably noticed that I've been referring to the passive as a voice. So it's not a tense, it's something you can use in any tense, in the past, present, future, or in the conditional tense. So it's something we refer to as a voice. And as I mentioned quickly, the passive in English is constructed by using the verb to be in any tense and a past participle. For example, it was eaten. So was is from our verb to be, and eaten is an example of a past participle. They will be sent. The pizzas are made. To check if something's a past participle in English, you can ask yourself if it sounds right after I have. So we could say I have eaten, I have sent, I have made. So we know that they're past participles. Now as I mentioned briefly in the introduction to this video, when you come across the passive voice in English and you want to translate it into Spanish, there are 4 possible ways that you can go about doing that translation. The first way, which we're going to call option 1, is what's called the true passive. So sometimes you can get away with literally translating passive statements in English into Spanish using the exact same structure, so the verb to be with a past participle. Now though you will come across, for sure, some of these true passive statements in Spanish, it's not as common and it's not as widely used as it is in English. But it is sometimes used, so it's one to be aware of. To form the true passive, just like in English, we use a tense of the verb to be and the past participle, you're going to do exactly the same thing in Spanish. But because in Spanish the past participle is being used as an adjective, and adjectives change in Spanish for masculine, feminine, singular and plural, you need to make sure it agrees with the subject. So if we were to translate the passive statement, the suitcase was stolen at the airport, we've got our verb to be in orange and our past participle in purple. So la maleta, and then was, we need to think what tense was that in? That's in the past tense, so let's go with fue, the preterite. La maleta fue, then the past participle is robado, and because it's la maleta, which is a feminine noun, it will become robada. En el aeropuerto. La maleta fue robada en el aeropuerto. So we've got that adjectival agreement. Feminine noun, feminine adjective. Now the verb ser needs to be conjugated to reflect the tense of the verb to be in English. So just as we did with was, which was fue, in this example we've got will be. The beach will be visited by many tourists. So that's the simple future tense. So it would become la playa será, and then because it's la playa and the past participle is visitado, it's going to become visitada. La playa será visitada por muchos turistas. So again, our adjectival agreement. Let's look at another example for this true passive. The novel had been read by many people. So here we've got the pluperfect tense, el pluscuamperfecto. La novela, and then had been, había sido, and then read, which would be leído, and again it's a feminine noun, la novela, so it's going to become leída por mucha gente. So we've got feminine noun, feminine adjective. The article was written by Juan Reyes. El artículo, and then was, past tense, fue. Then we need our past participle from escribir, which is escrito because it's an irregular one. And here it's el artículo, it's masculine, so we can leave that just as it is. Escrito por Juan Reyes. So masculine noun and a masculine past participle. And we haven't looked at any options for plural ones, but if it was los artículos, we then need to make sure the verb was plural, fueron, and then escrito would become escritos. Los artículos fueron escritos por Juan Reyes. The articles, in plural, were written by Juan Reyes. Now the second option to deal with the passive is to just say who did it. And this second option basically takes an English passive statement and turns it into an active statement in Spanish. And this helps you to avoid the passive completely, and it's quite common to do this in Spanish. So in English, we might say something like the book was written by Cervantes in whatever year. And in Spanish, we could do option 1 and translate this literally. El libro fue escrito por Cervantes. But if we make it active, then in English, it would become Cervantes wrote the book. So if we now translate this active statement into Spanish, it would become Cervantes escribió la novela, or el libro. Okay, so what starts as a passive statement in English becomes an active statement in Spanish. And it's more common to do this in Spanish than it is to do option 1 and write a literal passive statement. So now let's practice these two options. First, let's start with the true passive, option 1, with the phrase, the car was bought by my father. So when you're ready, pause the video, translate this into Spanish, remembering to think about adjectival agreement, and then push play and we'll look at the answer. Okay, so the answer is el coche fue comprado por mi padre. Because it's el coche, comprado just stays in its default form. It doesn't need to become comprados or comprada because it's el carro or el coche. Option 2, just say who did it, make it active. So first, have a think about what that active statement would become in English. The car was bought by my father. We could just as easily say, my father bought the car. So now pause the video and translate this active version of the statement into Spanish, remembering to be careful with the tense. Okay, so it's the preterite tense that we'd use for this. Mi padre compró el coche. Or you might have gone for mi padre compró el carro. Okay, so two different ways to talk about cars depending on where the Spanish that you're learning is from. Okay, let's do that process again now with another statement. The school was closed by the government. The government is el gobierno. Pause the video and then when you're ready, push play and we'll have a look at the answer. El colegio fue cerrado por el gobierno. Now option 2, let's make it active. So instead of saying the school was closed by the government closed the school. And now translate this active version of the statement into Spanish and then push play to have a look at the answer. So the answer is el gobierno cerró el colegio, again using the preterite tense. Okay, now we're going to practice 1 and 2 together. So translate the English literally into Spanish and then change the passive statement to say who did it. So first we've got the magazine was bought by my mother. Pause the video and do both of those steps. So first put it into the option 1, the literal translation, and then you can go straight to option 2 and make it active in Spanish and push play to look at the answer for this statement. So this one becomes la revista fue comprada por mi madre, and then option 2, mi madre compró la revista. Here's another one for you to pause the video and work into options 1 and 2. So this one becomes la guerra fue comenzada por Alemania. You could also say iniciada. Alemania comenzó la guerra. Or you could say Alemania inició la guerra. And this brings us on to option 3, which is what's called the se passive, because we use the verb with the se pronoun. This is the most common way to express an English passive voice in Spanish, and again it involves making the statement active. However, what's different is that this one doesn't really make sense for English speakers when you first come across it, because it makes the action, it makes the verb reflexive, which almost implies that the subject did the action to itself. So if you said, el libro se escribió, the book wrote itself, is how that might seem until you get the hang of this, which is why this is such an important one to learn, because it's probably the most common way to express things that we in English would express as a normal passive statement. In Spanish, this is how most of the time those statements are going to sound. So the tense of the verb to be in English tells you which tense you need to put the verb into, and then the past participle is the verb that you're going to use. So for example, the book was written in 1948. We think, what tense is this in? Was, that's going to be the preterite tense. Which verb is this? It's the verb to write, which is escribir. So now if we change the statement to literally mean the book wrote itself in 1948, it becomes el libro se escribió en 1948. So if you saw this in Spanish before watching this video, you might understand it, but you might think, what does that mean? The book wrote itself in 1948. Whereas now you're going to realize that means the book was written in 1948. It's just a completely different way to express the exact same idea. Ahora practiquemos. Now let's practice. The school was closed in 2020. Now let's go through this one together. Again, we need to ask ourselves certain questions like, what tense is this in? That's the past tense. We're going to use the preterite for that one. And which verb is this? It's the verb to close, which is the verb cerrar. And we need to make it reflexive. So first, the verb cerrar in the preterite becomes cerré, cerraste, cerró. And obviously it's the he, she, it version we're going to use. So we're going to use cerró with the reflexive pronouns, which are me, te, se. And because it's the third one we need, it's going to be se, because this is the se passive. So it's going to be se cerró. El colegio se cerró en 2020. For school, you might also say la escuela. Now, if this were in the plural, the schools were closed in 2020, then again, the tense is the same, the verb is the same, but it's plural. So it's not going to be the third person singular, cerró, it's going to become the third person plural, cerraron. Again with the se pronoun. Los colegios se cerraron en 2020. So now let's take a look at a couple more that you can practice on your own. So the first one is Spanish is spoken in Colombia, and that's in the present tense. So we know it's the present tense that we need to use, and we need to use the verb to speak, hablar. So now pause the video and translate that into Spanish using the se passive, the option 3 that we looked at, and then push play to look at the answer. Okay, so you might have come up with Español se habla en Colombia, which is perfectly fine, but it's more common to say se habla español en Colombia. Now this is quite a useful one because things like Spanish is spoken here or English is spoken here it's quite common to see those on signs in shops. Aquí se habla inglés, aquí se habla español. And another thing that you might see in shops is card payments are accepted here. Or literally, card payments accept themselves here. So again, this is going to be in the present tense. The verb to accept is aceptar. So pause the video and translate this one into Spanish. So you might have come up with los pagos en tarjeta se aceptan aquí, or probably what you'd see on a sign in Spain or in Latin America is aquí se aceptan tarjetas, or simply se aceptan tarjetas. Okay, now one final one to practice this. My birthday will be celebrated next week. So this time, have a think about what tense that one's in, and the verb celebrar. Pause the video and then push play to look at the answer. Okay, so it will be mi cumpleaños se celebrará la semana que viene, or quite often the verb goes at the beginning with the se passive, so it would become se celebrará mi cumpleaños la semana que viene. Now option 4, the very final, very last option, is called the anonymous they. And that might sound a bit ominous, but it simply means using the they form of the verb. So whilst the say passive is the most common way to express the English passive voice in Spanish, and it's one that you should definitely work towards mastering, it can sometimes be confusing. So sometimes, even though it's the go-to way of translating these things or way of expressing these things for most Spanish speakers, there are some phrases where it would give the wrong idea. For example, if you wanted to say, in a newspaper article, let's say, 5 soldiers were killed yesterday, if you were to use the say passive in Spanish, that would become 5 soldados se mataron ayer. And that could read as 5 soldiers killed themselves yesterday. So when you say something like el libro se escribió, everyone knows that the book didn't write itself. So we'd always read that as the book was written. Whereas because 5 soldiers could kill themselves, and matarse, matar in the reflexive, is a verb that is used, then that would give the wrong idea. So that rules out option 3, the say passive, for translating the phrase 5 soldiers were killed yesterday. And we can't do option 2 because we don't know who killed them, so we can't just say who did it. We could use option 1 and just do the literal translation and say 5 soldados fueron matados ayer. So because it's plural, soldados, we'll use the plural of the verb fueron and the plural word for killed, the past participle, matados. That would be fine, and quite possibly you could read that exact statement in a Spanish or Latin American newspaper. However, quite often in spoken Spanish, a Spanish speaker might say something like, mataron a 5 soldados ayer. Now literally, this is an active statement that means they killed 5 soldiers yesterday. But the they is anonymous. We don't know who they are. And this should be quite easy for you to grasp if you're a native English speaker, because we use this in English all the time as well. We might say something like, oh, they've closed the schools down, or they've closed the shop on the corner. We're not actually referring to a specific group of people. Sometimes we use the they pronoun as an anonymous they as well, just to say that something has happened. They've said that, blah, blah, blah. Quite often, it's exactly the same as in Spanish. It's an anonymous they. Ahora practiquemos con la opción 4. Now let's practice with option 4. If we have a statement in English like the borders will be opened next week, in English we want to rework this statement so that it says they, in the anonymous sense, will open the borders next week. And in Spanish, this would be abrirán las fronteras la semana que viene. So we're just taking the verb and putting it into whatever tense has been used in English, which in this case is the simple future, and making sure that we've used the correct form of the verb to mean they, which is always going to be the third person plural. Now to finish off, we'll just look at one more statement that you can do, and then we'll have a look at the answer. So the statement is, the shop has been closed, which in English, using the anonymous they, would become they have closed the shop, or they've closed the shop. And in Spanish, I want you now to write down what this statement would become, and then push play to look at the answer. So in Spanish, this would become han cerrado la tienda. So you don't need to say ellos han cerrado la tienda. If you do use the pronoun ellos or ellas, it would mean you were referring to a specific group of people. So you're just using the they form of the verb without the pronoun. Han cerrado la tienda. And that brings us to the end of this video lesson. Muchísimas gracias por ver. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this video has been useful, and hopefully now when you come across things like the say passive in Spanish, you're going to know exactly what it means. You're going to be able to create those statements yourself and translate the passive from English into Spanish in a way that sounds much more like a native speaker would say, and also you'll be able to recognize those things in Spanish and translate them back into English in a way that also sounds good in English. Otra vez, muchísimas gracias por ver y espero que te vaya muy bien con el español.